I'm Emily Chang, and this is the best of Bloomberg Technology, where we bring you all our top interviews from this week in tech. Coming up, what you need to know about the Intel chip saga, from the company's response to what big tech firms are doing to protect customers. Plus, Tesla struggles to manufacture for the masses, shipping fewer Model 3 sedans in the last quarter and pushing back a crucial production target. And we are tracking Spotify's unconventional IPO, why the music streaming site is attempting a direct listing, and is there really investor demand? First, to our lead. Intel disclosed this week that most of the processors running the world's computers and smartphones have a feature that makes them vulnerable to attack. As the largest chipmaker in the world, the impact is far-reaching. Intel says fixes are coming over the next few weeks, and it sees no material impact to its business. Google, which discovered the flaw, said the issue also affects other semiconductor firms. Microsoft, Apple, and Google said they secured their systems. Ian King covers chipmakers for Bloomberg Tech and explained what we need to know.
Google researchers and some academic researchers found out that this might be a problem going back to the middle of last year. The idea was, hey, we all get together, we all find a fix for this, then we put that fix in place. Then we go and say, hey, look, this is what happened, and we sorted it all out, don't worry. Unfortunately, news intervened and people found out. So now they're in this kind of scramble mode where Intel was forced to come out there and say, oh, it's not just us, it's not just us. And now we don't have all of these fixes in place. We don't know the impact that they're going to have on computers. A lot of concerns.
Are there any legal issues here?
Nobody has said anything yet, but this is the kind of thing that class action lawsuits are kind of designed for. Regulators might look at this and say, hold on a minute, you've got one or two companies who everything depends upon. Why are we giving them so much power? Why are we giving them so much influence and potential to damage?
So we're talking about almost every computer, smartphone, and server out there.
That's correct.
What are the actual impacts here? What does this flaw mean?
Okay, well, the first thing we have to point out is there's no evidence, no reports that anybody has actually exploited this vulnerability yet. They've all been careful to say that, but you have to say, well, if people didn't know about it, then maybe they weren't working on it. Now they know about it, maybe they're working on it. So the so far is the important thing here. But the important thing is, if you've got a computer at home, Emily, you have areas on your computer where passwords are stored, where, say, encryption keys are stored, and in the normal course of events, programs that you're using don't have access to that data. This feature of chips allows, in theory, access to that data for higher level programs and makes it more vulnerable as a result.
Now, Intel says they're not going to have a significant financial impact from this. How could that be?
Yeah, in the past, they've had to recall chips, just like a car maker has, or they've had to pay money to fix for patches. This time they're saying, look, this is a feature of chips. This makes chips faster. Our chips work as they should. We have no liability here.
Now, another thing that doesn't look good is that Intel found out about this, as you said, 6 months ago. CEO Brian Krzanich sold a very large chunk of Intel stock later in the year. What happened?
This, again, has created a lot of attention. But if you look at the filings, as our pay team did, and they really understand these things, this was a regularly announced plan. I mean, as you know, executives usually set out a plan where they say in advance, I'm going to sell this amount of shares, and that kind of insures them against accusations that they're trading on insider information. The timing of this, whether Intel really knew this was going to be such a big deal and affect its stock, that's obviously all up in the air, and we can't say with any concrete basis that he knew that this was coming.
Bloomberg's Ian King there. And we continued our coverage from the fallout from Intel News, speaking with Brian White, ForcePoint Vice President, and Bob O'Donnell, Technalysis Research President. Take a listen.
What we're talking about is a feature, this notion of speculative execution, that has been in processors for over 10 years. Nobody's discovered it until now, and it's used in Intel, AMD, ARM designs, and ARM licenses their chip designs to Apple, Qualcomm, MediaTek, NVIDIA, everybody's impacted. What I find fascinating about this whole story is I was brought in a couple weeks ago by these companies to get a sense, because they knew it was a big deal. And in 20 years as an industry analyst, I've never seen 3 companies come together in a briefing to talk about the issue and how they're addressing it as an industry. And to me, that is a very important side of the story that hasn't really been told that much. There are a lot of problems, to be absolutely clear, but there are interesting ways that the issue is going to be mitigated. I think we are going to see more discussions from, like you said, Apple and other people as well.
But do you think they should have told consumers?
I think that they were going to, and this was leaked in advance.
But it took 6 months.
Well, because it showed, I think Bob's exactly right, the transparency of the industry is working. They were working together. It was responsible disclosure, which is important. They found the vulnerability. They informed the manufacturer. They were working on a patch, and they were planning to announce it at some point, we believe, next week. Yet somebody wound up leaking the information, and now it's public. But I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that it shows that the community is taking security more seriously. They're more responsible. But what's scaring us all is that this is ubiquitous. You know, the Intel chip, the processors are in everything that we operate. And so if there are issues at this level, where are there not issues?
How serious is this issue in terms of actual impact? I mean, you know, Ian mentioned we don't know of anyone exploiting this flaw, but we also don't know a lot of things about attacks that are happening right now as we speak.
It's a fair point, and it still remains to be seen. There's some variants that are considered worse than others. Variant 3 in particular, which allows people to get access to private data, is the one that's being talked about a lot. That's the one that most people are trying to address immediately, and I think you're going to see some of these variations play out. But again, you know, it's interesting is this has been out there forever, and we're seeing this being addressed now. In theory, there are some definitely bad things that can happen, but the fact that it took 10 years to discover it should give you a sense of how hard it is to actually exploit some of these things.
Ryan, who could exploit this vulnerability?
Yeah, I think,
and what could they do with that information?
I would suggest that those that have significant resources, for example, Google has a significant security team that are able to spend the time necessary to really find this vulnerability. Those actors, such as nation states, may have the capability to know how to actually access and take advantage of this flaw. And I also think what's important here is there are no known attacks that are ongoing right now. It is still we're still unsure if you can execute this remotely or you need to be on the user machine. So there's a lot we don't know, but I do think that, you know, it just reinforces 2 things to me. One is that increasingly the software that we're operating is quite secure, because now we're looking at kernel level problems, which we're finding here. The second is that we know that if a determined adversary wants to gain access to a machine, they're going to gain access. It there's no way that they're not going to find a way in. And this is another way that they may be potentially able to exploit.
What should consumers do?
I think that consumers right now need to update. There are going to be 2 types of updates that come out. There's going to be software updates, and then there's going to be hardware updates. It's very easy to take down your software update. We do it, you know, often on our iPhone and everything else in our house. And I think the hardware update may be a bit more difficult depending on how exactly they push that out. But it is going to be straightforward. Given the attention that this is receiving, I think that the manufacturers are all over this, and we're going to all be fairly protected. However, what I do think is important is it enforces that you need to protect your data, and you need to understand who's accessing that data. So just like we do with our own personal data at home, do extra precautionary measures for what's most important, and also make sure that only certain people have access to it.
What do you think this foreshadows, Bob, for the year ahead in cyber?
Well, I think it's going to focus a lot of attention. In some ways, I've even seen a couple of people write articles to say, you know what, as bad as this is, and it is bad, it's going to lead to better things. Because what you do when you find these weaknesses is you redesign things in different ways. You re-architect software. You rebuild the hardware in order to do this. And to address a point you raised earlier, I mean, it's very common in the security world for people to tell people about an issue and give them time to fix it. Actually, normally what Project Zero does, I was told, is they give people 3 months. Well, because this was deep level stuff, they needed more than 3 months, and they were in fact scheduled to do it January 9th. So next Tuesday was the scheduled date, which was 6 months essentially past when they got it, because they knew they needed that extra time. So bottom line is, I think we're going to see more awareness of how this process occurs, and more sensitivity to what's going on, and people having to figure out how they do this. And we're going to have better update policies, because it's going to be hard. The firmware stuff, can be hard to update. With Apple, for example, they'll probably do it as a combined OS and firmware update, but like on a PC, you have to do a BIOS update and an OS update. That gets a little messy for a lot of people.
So, Brian, quickly, we know that companies are cooperating more clearly. We know that, vulnerabilities that are being discovered are even more specific, and yet the hackers are also getting better at their jobs, too. So, I mean, is anything changing? Are we under any less or more of a threat?
Yeah, I think first it's important to keep it in perspective. Understand your threat and understand what you need to do to ensure that you are adequately equipped. Second, remember to protect the data, and that to me is where security needs to live. It's not about protecting just the kernel. It's not about just protecting the software. It's understanding your data, and then it's understanding who interacts with the data. And just keep in mind that it's a layered approach. It's also basic training. It's all of those elements together that are over time going to increase our cyber hygiene and make us better.
That was Brian White with ForcePoint and Bob O'Donnell of Technalysis. Now, in other news, Barclays analyst Mark Moskowitz says Apple's offer to replace iPhone batteries cheaply could mean a big drop in future sales. Moskowitz writes that Apple may sell up to 16 million fewer iPhones this year. The analyst expects some customers to take advantage of the discounted batteries and skip potential upgrades to newer models in 2018. Coming up, Tesla pushed back a key production target for its pivotal Model 3 sedan, again, raising questions about whether the electric car maker may need to raise more cash. And later, we hear from Blackberry CEO Chang. He discusses the company's turnaround plans, tapping into the autonomous driving industry. This is Bloomberg. China-based Ant Financial Services Group has abandoned its plan to merge with MoneyGram International. This comes after the companies failed to win approval from the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. The National Security Panel has recently become more active in blocking Chinese investments in American companies. Last year, Ant Financial offered $18 a share in cash for Dallas-based MoneyGram, valuing the deal at $1.2 billion. Tesla has pushed back a production target for its all-important Model 3 yet again. This after shipping fewer cars than expected last quarter, shedding more light on Elon Musk's self-confessed production hell. The company now expects to hit producing 5,000 cars a week by the end of the second quarter, delaying that goal by another 3 months. Tesla delivered 1,550 Model 3s in the final 3 months of the year, trailing analysts' average estimate of just over 2,900 units. We broke down the numbers with Bloomberg Businessweek's Max Chafkin. So, Max, why are these numbers so bad?
Well, they're bad just because this is now, another delay from basically Elon Musk, last year said he hoped to be hitting this 5,000 a week goal by the end of the year. Then it was 3 months. Now it's 6 months. I will say that, as bad as these numbers are, Tesla's done a pretty good job sort of managing expectations. If you looked at what analysts were saying at the beginning of the week, a lot of people were expecting, some sort of disappointment. I mean, basically, Musk has conveyed to investors and the public that they want to get this right, that this is taking a long period of time. That said, it definitely gives plenty of ammunition to skeptics who are just questioning whether Tesla will be able to meet these what really are wildly ambitious production goals, whether they happen in the middle of next year or even later than that.
So we do have a chart showing production on the Bloomberg here, G#BTV2341, which shows the number of cars produced every quarter. So overall, they're holding about steady. But what do the numbers overall indicate about just how hellish production indeed is?
Yeah, I mean, it's just way below what we were expecting. Now, I wouldn't read too much into the production numbers of the Model S and Model X, which are sort of the more expensive luxury cars, because basically a lot of consumers want this Model 3, the mass market car. Plus, Tesla already has claimed a pretty big chunk of the luxury car market. The real question is, once you get into the mass market $35,000 or $40,000 car range, whether Tesla can really, do the kinds of things that these big car companies, GM, Toyota, have been able to do. And right now, Elon Musk has done a fantastic job of sort of getting analysts, getting everybody to see this is basically a bet on the future. But the future gets closer and closer each quarter, and each quarter that Tesla isn't able to get to this mass market electric car that we've been promised for a decade, the sales pitch is going to get harder, and it's going to continue to cause people to ask questions about the company's future.
So why is Wall Street so focused on this when the absolute numbers we're talking about here are still so small?
Because for Tesla to justify this enormous valuation, it needs to be a mainstream car company, and to be a mainstream car company, it needs to be able to produce, you know, these mass market numbers, and not just to justify its valuation, but I mean to meet the ambitious goals that Elon Musk has set for himself, and you know, for humanity, as he probably would put it. If you want to get us off, you know, fossil fuels, you need to get the cost of electric cars down, and so you know, it's all well and good to sell, you know, $120,000 luxury SUVs, but if you really want to, you know, make a dent in the universe, so to speak, and then you need to sell these you know, mass market cars.
And still, analysts are saying Tesla is way ahead of the competition. I mean, put this in the broader context for us.
Right. That's sort of the bull case here, which is that any problem that Elon Musk and Tesla are going through at the moment, his competitors are going to have to go through it. What Tesla has said is that one of the big problems is happening at the company's Gigafactory, which is where they're making these battery packs. Now, you have to assume that any other car company that wants to, you know, make a mass market electric car is going to also have to deal with battery production issues. So the bet would sort of be that, you know, Toyota, GM, or whatever will have to go through this as well. The other side of that is, you know, these are companies that are really experienced at dealing with supply chains, at dealing with manufacturing, you know, big hulking pieces of machinery. Tesla obviously has less experience there, so you know, maybe they'll be able to deal with it faster. That said, I mean, you know, you have to admit that Tesla has done pretty well as far as getting people to buy electric cars. I mean, the Model S has you know, outpaced you know, expectations of where they were at least even a couple years ago.
That was Bloomberg Businessweek's Max Chafkin. Coming up, BlackBerry takes to the road with Chinese internet giant Baidu. We'll hear from BlackBerry CEO Chang next. And later in the show, we'll speak with Microsoft's president and chief legal officer about the role of technology in the current U.S. administration. This is Bloomberg. Google saved at least $3.7 billion in taxes in 2016 with its so-called Dutch sandwich structure. That's according to filings in the Netherlands. The setup involves shifting revenue from one Irish subsidiary to a Dutch company with no employees, and then on to a Bermuda mailbox owned by another Ireland-registered company. Google is under pressure from regulators around the world for not paying enough in taxes. BlackBerry has signed a deal with Chinese internet giant Baidu to work together on driverless car software. The Ontario-based company's QNX vehicle operating system and in-car entertainment software will be bundled into Baidu's self-driving car platform, Apollo. Baidu has been signing up dozens of partners around the world in a bid to eventually become a dominant automotive software company. We spoke with BlackBerry CEO Chang about the deal.
We've been working with most everybody in the ecosystems, and this is one of the latest announcement of a number of partners that we have signed up. And you know, we have Qualcomm and Delphi and Denso, all in the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 months. And this just happened to be, you know, the next major partners that we sign up.
So how does this exactly help BlackBerry's push into the self-driving car industry?
Well, we are providing this, in all cases, we're providing the safety operating systems, safety and security part of the operating system for the autonomous vehicle and the platform. So, you know, that's how we are gonna, one of our strategies, you know very well, when we first talk about me taking this job, was to really create a new category for us to dominate in. And I wouldn't use the word dominate, but we certainly are doing extremely well right now in that category. So
how will BlackBerry help Baidu become a dominant player in the car industry, which is their goal?
Baidu has as you pointed out, is quite ambitious in creating the autonomous platform or the autonomous vehicle platform. And so they're putting together some code and in a lot of partnership, and they pull us in as as their operating system platform. As again, I pointed out the fact that they picked us because of the safety and the security certification that we have in QNX. And with that, they should be rather complete in going after the car industry, the auto industry. And I assume that the auto industry will go beyond just the auto that you and I know of today. They are going to provide maps and digital information also. So I think this is a pretty good partnership, and we're bringing some very good things together.
So talk to us about the impact that you see of this partnership on BlackBerry's business, and give us any hard numbers if you can.
I can't give you any hard numbers, and you know that. I know you have to ask that. It's going to be, it's going to be our growth platform. You should know today, my growth business is on the enterprise software, especially with security and cybersecurity. The next leg of our growth is with the auto, and this is why the design wins is so important. And we're going to go beyond the auto and go into the embedded world, in the so-called the EOT or the IoT world. It's a huge market, and it's growing, and we're very fortunate that we could play well in it.
Are there any other partnerships with other automakers in the works, and how do you plan to pursue more partnerships?
Oh, yeah. You should expect us to continue to expand our ecosystems. I think our attention in the last couple, 2-3 years has been winning new design, joining up with new partnership, creating new platform, like the one we just announced with Denso on HMI, human-machine interface. All really good new stuff that, some of those are a little sci-fi-ish, but it's going to happen. And you should expect BlackBerry to continue to grow the partnership and ecosystem, and we're working on a ton of them.
So how does all of this fit into the context of BlackBerry's broader turnaround strategy? Tell us, what else is working and what's not working, and how this business evolves, as it has evolved considerably since you've taken it over.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would not call us in a turnaround mode anymore. We make money. We generate growth in the right area. We have very good footprint in the cybersecurity enterprise for regulated industry, in particular, like the banks and the governments and the healthcare. Those are growing. Last quarter, we announced that our billings on the enterprise software grew 20%, and the QNX organizations focusing on design wins. We're announcing really big design wins. You will expect to, I'm hoping to see more, and you should expect to see more. So when we marry the two together in the future, we're going to have a platform of security for IoT management. And so, as I said, I'm very excited about the future of the company. We are executing to it. We are showing the results. So it's not just the strategy on a piece of paper like the first time you and I spoke. Now we're really delivering, and I'm very pleased with the fact that we're doing that.
That was BlackBerry CEO Chang. Coming up, the Iranian government is cracking down on social media as waves of protests grip the country. We explore the evolving role of tech for those hitting the streets next. And a reminder, all episodes of Bloomberg Technology are now live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology weekdays, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Anti-government protests have swept across Iran this week, and once again, technology is playing a crucial role. Now, messaging app Telegram, used by roughly half the population of Iran, and Instagram appear to be blocked in the country. We talked about this with former CIA military analyst Tara Mahler, who is now a senior policy advisor at the Counter-Extremism Project.
This is not really surprising. Iran has already had a number of social media sites and applications blocked prior to this. For example, Facebook and Twitter had already been blocked in various forums, and they've done this in the past. They've restricted access. So what we're hearing now is, in addition to what was normally and previously blocked, there's been additional blocks put on. The CEO of Telegram tweeted out yesterday that Telegram channels have been blocked in an effort by the Iranian government to quell protesters. And also we're seeing that there have been potential internet shutdowns in various parts of the country as well. Again, none of this is surprising. The Iranian government taking on, a higher form of censorship now as they're trying to crush any form of dissent across the country.
I'm recalling the use of Twitter back in the day, years ago, which, precipitated the blocking of Twitter in Iran. Talk to us about how protesters are using technology in Iran today and how it has evolved from those years.
Sure. Technology has been critical. Obviously now, compared to 2009, you have had a rise in not just the number of individuals using iPhones and all sorts of, mobile devices, but you've also had growth in terms of individuals all over the globe, Iran included, using social media and using different applications to communicate, in some cases encrypted applications. This helps them organize, this helps them communicate, engage in peaceful protests. It helps them coordinate, times and locations, and also spread ideas in opposition to the Iranian government, which we've seen ideas that have been protesting both the economy there and also protesting the ideology in some cases as well. So I think you see technology being critical. It is worth noting that even though that the government in Iran is taking steps to quell protesters by blocking their access, the Iranians have gotten savvy about workarounds in some of these cases. A lot of them have ways to access these social media platforms, even though the government has prohibited them.
So, we should also note that the use of technology also has a dark side, including Telegram, and Telegram has also been reportedly used by terrorists to communicate. Is that correct still?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the other areas that these applications have been used for have not been for peaceful protests, but also by terrorist organizations. This is something that technology companies have been grappling with consistently over the last year or two as well. ISIS and other terrorist organizations using Telegram both on public channels, but also more private channels to communicate, spread their ideology, and spread their propaganda, something that my organization, Counter-Extremism Project, has actually been pressuring tech companies on in terms of cracking down on content which violates their terms of service in the case of terrorism. In the case of Iran, much of the protests that are going on there are peaceful protests and demonstrations, things that obviously the United States government is in full support of them being able to do. And I believe the State Department has also been using these channels to try to communicate with peaceful protesters there as well.
And what has Telegram in particular done to combat the use of its platform for terrorist ends?
Well, I think you're seeing the tech companies start to be a bit more responsive. You saw, for example, YouTube, which is part of Google, take down Anwar al-Awlaki videos recently. Telegram still has, a ways to go. And in some cases, a lot of these channels are closed. In some cases, there's encrypted communications. So personally, we think that Telegram should be enforcing its terms of service. Any sort of violent jihadist content or content that violates the terms of service ought to be taken down, ought not to be permitted. And users that are either affiliated with terrorist organizations or posting this material should have their accounts suspended. This is something we've seen tech companies being a little bit more responsive on over the past year after coming under increased pressure, not just from the European Union, but from Capitol Hill, Democrats and Republicans alike, particularly in light of the recent hearings on Russia propaganda. Lots of concerns of just about nefarious actors using these platforms in ways that are in violation of the terms of service.
So, and we've talked about this over the years, Tara, but what do you expect to come from tech companies this year, like Facebook and like Twitter, when it comes to combating these issues more head on, and what do you hope to see from them?
Well, I think what you're going to see is you're going to see a continued buildup of pressure from Capitol Hill. I think you're going to see more hearings centered on terrorist use of these platforms and what tech companies are and are not doing. I think you're going to see a push for more regulation in this area if you don't see the tech companies start to take concrete and specific measures to show demonstrable progress in terms of getting these actors off their platforms. Look, we have lists of individuals here in the United States that are on sanctions lists, terrorist individuals on sanctions lists. You can't do business with those actors, and if you do, you're in violation of the sanctions policy. In a similar way, I mean, our opinion has been they should not have free reins, terrorist organizations or individuals promoting terrorist content, to operate in virtual safe havens on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Google. And I think you're going to start seeing more public pressure. And I'm optimistic you'll see tech companies being more responsive. I hope it doesn't take a series of more terrorist attacks and more deaths before they do so, because we do see that online radicalization has become a problem in pretty much all of the homegrown cases and most of the cases in Europe that we've seen.
That was Tara Mahler from the Counter-Extremism Project. Well, the tech industry's relationship with the Trump administration got off to a rocky start after many of Silicon Valley's largest companies protested his immigration policies. One of the loudest voices was Microsoft and its president and chief legal officer, Brad Smith. Tom Keene and Francine Lacroix spoke with Brad Smith on a special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance from the Eurasia Group with president and founder Ian Bremmer. They started the conversation by asking Smith about the role of technology over the next 5 years.
We're seeing technology have several important impacts. I mean, it's with the advent of artificial intelligence or AI, we're going to see an ongoing impact on not just businesses and governments, but also economies and jobs. And I think people are bracing for that, but we're still looking to the future without a clear sense yet of exactly which jobs will be eliminated, which new jobs will be created, what new digital skills will people need in order to take these jobs. And then I think the other thing to think about is just sort of the international aspects of this. At one level, IT, information technology, has become more global. The industry has become more global. This is another area where Ian has been saying that we are seeing the rise of China. We're seeing Chinese tech leaders really emerge now as global tech leaders. And yet at the same time, we're seeing fragmentation in the technology sector. They're no longer, in some respects, is quite a global internet as we conceived of it a decade ago. And I think 5 years from now, we may see a bit more of that fragmentation.
Well, Brad, part of your charm is you're not in Silicon Valley. You're up in the real world of Seattle, Washington. I guess that's the real world. Silicon Valley right now is a piñata for Washington. Everybody's going after them. How afraid should San Francisco, and the cliche of Google or Apple, your good competitors, how afraid should they be of Washington in 2018?
Well, first of all, I find when I get to Washington or New York that most people seem to think that Seattle is either just next door to Silicon Valley or part of it.
That's true.
I think for all of us, there is an increasing tension, if you will, between the West Coast and the East Coast. I think we've been seeing this unfold over the last decade. You certainly see political commentators in Washington, D.C. identify the tech sector as a piñata, as you mentioned. It's not just those on the left, it's those on the right, it's those on the center. I don't know that people have yet transferred that concern about technology into a defined course of potential political regulation, but that could come. And I think it really behooves all of us in the tech sector to be listening to that and to be out addressing the concerns and even just acknowledging the concerns, which I think Silicon Valley's sometimes been a little bit slow to do.
Well, let's move to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or maybe to English common law, and talk to Ian Bremmer about the tech commons. What a great phrase within your study of technology for this year. What is the tech commons, and what does it mean for us?
Well, you've got the president of Microsoft saying that, what we thought was going to be a global tech commons increasingly looks like you're going to see fragmentation. You see that in the internet space. And as we move from the information revolution to data revolution, it's much more top-down, right? And so the space that's being created, the way that people are engaging, and the filters that they see to engage in content commerce or through surveillance, those increasingly are either coming from a bunch of fragmented companies that are competing with each other, very sophisticated in the U.S., or it's through the Chinese government. Those are two completely different models. And that's not the U.S.-led globalization that we had been thinking about for the last 40 years. I think you could make an argument that the Facebooks and Googles and Microsofts are easily as strategically important for the United States, for our economy and our national security in the next 10 years as Lockheed and Raytheon ever were during the Cold War. But I don't think that the U.S. government is prepared to align with these companies that way. I don't think they have the technological sophistication to understand how to do it. And I also think that some of the Silicon Valley libertarianism is problematic there. But in China, you want to talk about patriotic corporations, right? It's all kind of the same thing. And I think that's going to be an incredibly important space for Brad to be a leader of.
Francine?
And Brad, actually to Ian's point, which government is ahead of the curve, right? If you have all these transformational changes in technology and how you retrain people and educate people for jobs of tomorrow that we don't even know of yet, who and how do you educate the governments to be able to do that retraining?
Well, I think I would say two things today. First, when you look at government support or investment in AI, I think one would be hard-pressed to find a government that is more focused or determined than the Chinese to make this area a success. You can contrast that with what we see in Washington, D.C., where this administration, I think, is more focused on traditional manufacturing and the like than the so-called digital or new economy. So we see an enormous divergence there. When you then get into the area of skills, I think it's a lot harder to find a government that is really yet out at the forefront. In the United States, we're seeing some leadership at the state level, which is not surprising. That's where we would probably expect to see it first. I look at a state like Colorado, where Governor Hickenlooper has been very focused on this the last couple of years. Look at the United Kingdom, which has been investing heavily in getting coding into schools. But it's such early days when we think about what the impact of AI on jobs is going to be, that I don't think any government has yet really formulated a strategy to address it.
I mean, a lot of people expect a lot of these changes, Brad, to happen in the next, I guess, 10 to 15 years. Are we underestimating it or overestimating? Will it be sooner or at a later date?
There's no doubt that over the next 2 decades, it is going to be an AI era, and it is going to reshape every sector of the economy. It is probably going to touch virtually every job that exists in the economy today in every country in one way or another.
That was Microsoft President and Chief Legal Officer Brad Smith on Bloomberg Surveillance. Coming up, Spotify preps for its unconventional public offering. The latest details and what this means for startups looking for an exit ahead. This is Bloomberg. Didi Chuxing is buying Brazilian ride-hailing company 99 Taxis. The acquisition puts Didi in direct competition with Uber and in one of Uber's busiest international markets. Last year, the Chinese ride-hailing giant led a $100 million investment in the Brazilian company. Terms of the cash deal weren't released. The move is the latest signal in that the industry may become dominated by global companies instead of local monopolies. Music streaming giant Spotify has confidentially filed for an IPO. That's according to a person familiar with the matter. Spotify will go ahead with a plan to skip a traditional stock sale and list its stock directly. A direct listing avoids underwriting fees and restrictions on stock sales by current owners. The stock will list on the New York Stock Exchange. We spoke about it all with our Bloomberg reporters Alex Barinka and Lucas Shaw.
Spotify has planned to go public either late this past year, 2017, or early 2018. It really came down to when they could get their books in order. They felt like they could close their books from an accounting perspective in just a couple of weeks. They're clearly comfortable with that. You know, financially, they've never really needed to go public just to raise money, which is why they're taking this unconventional path of a direct listing as opposed to a more traditional IPO. They were under pressure to do so as quickly as possible to get out from underneath the terms of this convertible debt that they'd raised from TPG and Dragoneer. And so it was really just a matter of the fastest they could do it that they were comfortable with, they were going to, and so now they're clearly comfortable.
So, Alex, how is a direct listing different from a typical listing?
So in a real IPO, a classic IPO, you hire bankers, they help you craft a story, they go out on a roadshow, they try to figure out within certain terms what valuation the investors are willing to swallow. This cuts out a lot of that. A direct listing,
and by the way, that costs money.
Exactly. Right? They pay the underwriters anywhere from 2.5%, which is what Snap did, to up to 7% of the entire raise. With this, it's different. They basically just come out and say, look, our stock is trading now. We don't know exactly how the mechanics are going to work, but in the past direct listings that I've looked at, these very small companies, biotech or real estate investment trusts that have listed, they basically just open the shares on day one like a normal open auction. And that can kind of inject some questions. Is there enough supply? Is there enough demand? Where does the price stand? These are all things that they will have to kind of suss through that could inject a lot of volatility into the share. So you might cut out some of those underwriting fees, but it seems like if they're moving ahead with this, they say they don't need to go out and scream their story from the rooftops like a classic IPO, and they don't need 14 banks coming in telling them how to sell their story.
Lucas, what does this mean for the economics of the early investors? Does this mean more money for everyone in the end who's already an insider?
Those early investors who choose to sell when they have the opportunity are going to make a killing. If you're to believe recent reports about what the company is now valued at, which is 15 billion, as much as 20 billion, the last time they raised money in kind of the spring of 2016, they were valued at 8.5 billion. So while I'm sure there'll be some kind of complications as to who gets to pull out money when or what the terms were, most of the early investors, should they choose to sell, are in line to make a killing. And if I might, I do think that avoiding the underwriting fees might be somewhat of a motivation, but I think that the choice to go with a direct listing reflects a company led by a guy in Daniel Ek who really enjoys doing things differently from how kind of the system tells him he needs to do it. And that's a big motivation here.
So the question is it the right strategy? And is there any precedent for this, Alex? And how has that played out?
The direct listing precedent isn't there for a big company, but this does make me think back to Google, right? Google went out with a Dutch auction. It was a different kind of IPO. They raised 1.67 billion. They had to cut the price down. They had to cut the number of shares down. And then they came out a year later and sold $4 billion worth of stock. And there were some questions about dilution then. So there's a precedent for doing things differently. This will be the first real test case. And when I talk to my sources on the street who are in the IPO world, nobody's really come out and said, hey, I want to do this next. But everyone is going to watch this very carefully, especially the biggest companies who don't need the capital that would be raised from an IPO. This might be something that's considered. But again, it's a big if right now. Right. We've got to see how this gets executed.
So, Lucas, what do we know? Obviously, we know the valuation is high, but what do we know about Spotify's financial situation and engagement situation as compared to, let's say, Apple Music?
Spotify's revenue has been growing rapidly along with its user base. The arrival of Apple and some other competitors, if anything, helped Spotify because it made more people aware of the fact that there were these services where you could stream millions of songs on demand. Spotify now has more than 60 million paying customers, more than 140 million users. And its margins have improved. It negotiated new deals with all of the major rights holders, the record labels and publishers, that gave it slightly better terms. And most of the people who've pored over the different filings that they have issued say that the picture looks better and better. They have real cash flow, which a lot of startups don't at this point.
And quickly, Lucas, talk to us about the implications of this lawsuit that we've just learned about.
So there are a lot of songwriters who are upset with Spotify because they feel like they never had their work licensed or they're not getting paid enough. Spotify thought it had settled this case last year, but some other songwriters have filed suit recently asking for more. They've asked for more than they're likely to get, but this is a headache that Spotify would certainly like to do away with before it goes public.
That was Bloomberg's entertainment reporter Lucas Shaw and IPO reporter Alex Barinka. Coming up, we will preview the world's biggest gadget show, why top tech companies are returning to the showroom floors after several years of low attendance. And if you like Bloomberg News, you can check us out on the radio. You can now listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. Lyft is set to show off a fully automated ride-hailing service at CES next week. The company will partner with Aptiv, a self-driving software company that formed when supplier Delphi split into two companies. Lyft and its larger U.S. rival Uber are betting driverless vehicles will be a pivotal point to their longer-term business prospects. Last year, Lyft announced plans to enable self-driving developers and car makers to plug into its network of nearly 1 million rides per day. And staying with CES, this year Google is setting up a booth for the first time in years. And executives from Amazon, Apple, and Facebook are expected to be roaming the showrooms. We caught up with Bloomberg Tech reporter Mark Bergen for all the details.
We can expect a lot more of last year, which was home speakers and Alexa were the big part of the show in Vegas. Now there's a lot more competitors, right? Google is pushing out its own version of its home speakers. Apple's apparently working on one. Samsung, a slew of Chinese companies are there. And I think what we're seeing this year is that a lot of the major tech companies, both here and in China, are working heavily on AI, and they're working on AI features where you have software combining with hardware.
What is Google's interest here specifically?
Right, Google's invested a lot in hardware this year. They went out and bought a big team from HTC. They have their Pixel line. Effectively, Google wants to make sure they don't cede the living room and a lot of the home spaces to competitors like Amazon, Apple, Facebook. Right? I mean, Google's aware that the future is moving to a world in which most likely, we're using devices beyond phones. We're talking to our devices. They have the big lead here on the software side, and they just want to make sure that they're still involved with everyone's lives.
My question was going to be, does it seem like anyone is in the lead when it comes to the living room? I mean, we know Amazon got a real head start with Echo on home speakers, but obviously Apple is going to be coming to market with one soon.
Yeah, I mean, people will say, Google will say, Apple will say this market is still pretty young, which it is. Amazon has a big lead with developers, which is key, right? You're having a lot more developers build software and apps effectively for the Echo. That's still pretty premature. I think there's a chance here that Google, Apple, there's some companies coming out of China that could really make a mark here.
So when we say Apple, Amazon, Facebook executives will be roaming the showrooms, what does that mean?
At a lot of the conferences, Apple executives don't even wear name tags. But we do have a sense that this will be becoming a much more priority for all those companies. They're going to be there looking for key suppliers. There are a lot of, Mark Gerben, my colleague, wrote a really good story about this, how down in supply chain you need specialized chip. You need a lot more hardware to keep up with the advances in software. And that's also where this show is major for the car companies now, right? It's the same week as the Detroit Auto Show. That sort of shows the epicenter is gravitating towards Silicon Valley and towards Vegas, as opposed a lot of car companies are looking at the future of electronics, at autonomy, and they'll also be prowling the showroom floor for the same reason.
While I have you, I do want to ask you about Eric Schmidt stepping down as executive chairman of Alphabet. He's still on the board, but there's a lot of questions about why this is happening now, and in the way it did, it seemed a bit abrupt. Is there something bigger at play here? I
don't know about something bigger. Eric has sort of stepped down a lot from a larger role. He was sort of the ambassador, the Secretary of State of Google for years. Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, has become much more of the public face. And Eric Schmidt was very much tied with the Hillary campaign, so his standing in D.C. sort of since the election has fallen a little bit. And from what I've heard, he's not been as active. You have the general counsel, you have the government affairs team, but there is a big gap there. Google still does not have a global policy chief. They have an interim person right now. It's unclear if they're really thinking about reevaluating their larger strategy, both in D.C. and then kind of globally and in politics.
That was Bloomberg Technology's Mark Bergen. And be sure to tune into our coverage of the world's biggest gadget show, including our interview with Sony CEO Kazuo Hirai on Tuesday. And that does it for this edition of the Best of Bloomberg Technology. We will bring you all the latest in tech throughout the week. Tune in each day, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. And remember, all episodes of Bloomberg Technology are live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out weekdays at Technology. That is all for now. This is Bloomberg.